Well, it depends what you mean by improving people's lives. I suppose in terms of bringing people out of poverty, Deng Xiaoping must be a candidate for a leader who's done most. If we mean introducing greater freedom than people have enjoyed before, then Mikhail Gorbachev would be a stronger candidate. So a lot depends on the criteria we have for improving people's lives. Similarly, for the opposite, if we mean people being terrorized, then Stalin and Hitler would be almost rival candidates for which has been the most vicious and unpleasant and nasty. In terms of simply destroying people's lives unnecessarily, Mao Zedong would be a strong candidate. The Great Leap Forward was such a total disaster leading to starvation, and many people were simply killed because they refused to make the Great Leap. So there are many candidates. Sometimes in an authoritarian regime one can argue that things are better than before. In Cuba, for example, Fidel Castro was certainly an authoritarian leader, but and the Cuban economy has not been a success story. Nevertheless, there have been some successes, reasonable level of education, and quite a good health service. Well, I think to some extent I've already answered that question, because I regard the Scandinavian countries, including Finland, certainly Norway, Sweden, Denmark, as remarkably successful countries. They've got a high standard of living, high degree of tolerance, very democratic, and they don't have overpowerful leaders. Very often they're coalition governments, and there's quite a lot of consensus. These governments also have some problems now, and especially in a country like Denmark, now there's concern about immigration, and so it's probably the case that countries with a more homogeneous population find it easier to retain this tolerance. And similar in Germany, which has been a success story in the post-war era, the very large number of refugees who were allowed in by Angela Merkel, very honourably, but nevertheless that has caused quite a lot of discontent. But still, post-war Germany, Scandinavia, to a certain extent this country, Canada, Australia, these have all, to my mind, been very successful democracies. And they've not been countries which have felt the need of a strong leader. Well, I argue that a leader who is empathetic, collegial, is a good listener, has a good memory, and is quite content to see colleagues get the praise for decisions that have been taken, not wanting to be praised for everything himself or herself, or do everything himself or herself. That's the best kind of leadership. Now, very often leaders who aspire to be strong in a democracy, they're not as strong as they make out. So if we take Donald Trump, for example, Trump was regarded as a strong leader, and in his 2016 American election, strong leader was twice as important a factor for voters as it was in the previous presidential election. We know that from exit poll data. And Trump is perceived to be a strong leader, both in America and internationally, and yet he's achieved almost nothing. I mean, zero legislation through Congress that he wanted. He's lost many of the most important members of his administration, but he's very assertive and wants to be all-powerful. And in fact, he's finished up being able to do far less than somebody who was much more of a bridge builder could have achieved. Well, in a way, this is why I'm writing this book. I'm trying to persuade people that what they should be looking for in politics is not one leader who will solve all their problems, but to be urging people to be skeptical about a leader who wants to concentrate more and more power in his or her hands. I mean, there are a lot of people who think their problems would be solved if only the right leader was put in place and given vast power. But that's an illusion. And so I think, we have to take responsibility ourselves and look for politicians who will share responsibility and who will act collegially. Of course, competition between parties is essential. If you've got no competition between parties, then it's only a pretense of a democracy. But a certain amount of collegiality and dispersal of power within a government is absolutely essential. Well, the relationship between a leader and society should be one of listening on both sides. The leader must be responsive to public opinion, but doesn't necessarily have to follow public opinion on everything. I mean, in this country, we would still have capital punishment if we simply followed majority opinion. I don't know about the most recent polls, but many polls over the years have shown a majority of people in favour of capital punishment. But members of Parliament a long time ago abolished capital punishment. And so this is a case where members of Parliament are ahead of the public and quite rightly are giving a lead. And again, it's not just a matter of one leader. I mean, for example, as far as I remember, Margaret Thatcher was in favour of capital punishment, but Parliament as a whole was against. So we don't need to rely on prime ministers to give the lead. Politicians generally can give a lead. So it has to be a relationship in which the politicians are not so out of touch with the population that people become alienated. And there has been some tendency towards that in the United States, and that partly explains the election of Trump. And more extreme inequality in the United States than there was 30 or 40 years ago. And in this country too, there's been a similar tendency. So some people would say that Brexit, the British exit from the European Union, is also partially to be explained by politicians getting too far out of touch with public opinion. So even in something like immigration, which is a big issue in many countries, including Britain, politicians again can give a lead, but they must pay some attention to what people are thinking, and so they can persuade the public that a certain amount of immigration is desirable and morally justified, but at the same time they must pay attention to the fact that people are worried about unrestricted immigration. So there's got to be a kind of two-way process. If you ask about the goals of the goal of politics, I think there are many goals, so we shouldn't think in terms of just one. Usually people who think of just one goal, a society in which everyone will be equal, it's not really possible to have such a society, but you can reduce inequalities, you can improve health standards, you can improve educational levels, and one of the most important things is the education of women, because there are many problems, including the population explosion in the world today, which is a serious problem, which could be resolved with education of women in societies where they are deprived of that education, because on the whole, educated women tend to have fewer children, and that's quite a significant factor. So, economic growth, I think, should not be made an absolute, because economic growth produces problems of its own, environmental, and indeed one of the greatest problems in the world today is precisely the environmental one. We could destroy the planet we live on. So this is certainly one of the greatest challenges for politicians in our day. And there can be a tension between economic growth and employment in traditional industries and environmental protection. So one of the tasks of the politician is to be able to balance different priorities and still get a wise solution. And that tends to happen in a more collegial government in which everyone can express their view rather than one person laying down the line and dictating. I'm absolutely against one leader being able to foreclose the discussion, end the discussion by pulling rank and saying, I'm the leader, so I must decide. That's not the way to achieve a successful policy.